Civilizations have vanished overnight, leaving their trade arteries buried in silence. These were the complex networks of roads and sea lanes that pumped goods, ideas, and wealth across continents, and their sudden erasure is one of history's greatest puzzles. By the end of this journey, you will understand the hidden forces that can make a global economy disappear without a trace. We will explore why bustling ports like Muziris vanished from all maps and how entire cities along the Silk Road were abandoned with meals still on the table. What does the fate of these forgotten connections reveal about our own interconnected world? A trade artery is the living pulse of a civilization, a complex system far beyond dirt and stone. It moves spices and silk, certainly, but it also carries new words, forgotten gods, and blueprints for machines across thousands of miles. To see its true nature, look at the famous roads of Rome. These were engineering marvels, straight and strong, but their purpose was not just for marching soldiers. They were the empire's circulatory system. Along them traveled olive oil from Spain, glass from Syria, and letters from the frontier, all weaving a tapestry of shared identity from Britain to Egypt. This network demanded constant care, a colossal investment in bridges that defied rivers, harbors that tamed seas, and way stations that offered rest and security. Its protection was guaranteed by legions and a web of alliances, creating a fragile order that allowed a city in Gaul to thrive on Egyptian grain. The prosperity of the heartland was entirely dependent on the vitality of these distant, thrumming veins. So when we find one of these pathways silent, its stones scattered and its purpose forgotten, we are not just looking at an abandoned road, we are witnessing the final, chilling symptom of a collapse that reached every corner of that world. How does something so robust, so integral, simply cease to be? The answer lies in the first great mystery of a pathway that vanished from the earth. Standing in the ruins of a caravanserai, you can almost hear the ghosts of commerce. The dust that coats the empty courtyards once swirled around the feet of camels, weighed down with Chinese silk and Roman glass. Inside these mud brick walls, merchants from worlds apart would barter not just goods, but ideas, languages, and technologies, creating a temporary, vibrant microcosm of a connected world. The sheer speed of their abandonment is what chills the soul. We find evidence of lives interrupted, a cooking pot left near a cold hearth, a child's toy dropped in a doorway, a ledger half filled with transactions that would never be completed. This was not a slow decline, a gradual winding down of business. This was a sudden stop. So what force could silence such a vital hub so completely? The answer is rarely one single villain, but a cascade of failures. A prolonged drought could have dried up the vital oases that dotted the desert, turning a challenging journey into an impossible one. Meanwhile, far to the south, sailors were mastering the monsoon winds, offering a sea route that could carry vast quantities of goods, avoiding bandits and desert heat altogether. But perhaps the most critical factor was the splintering of the Mongol Empire. For nearly a century, the Pax Mongolica, or Mongol peace, had stretched from the Pacific to the Mediterranean, creating a unified zone of safety for travel. With its collapse, that safety shattered. The single great empire was replaced by 100 squabbling kingdoms and warlords, each demanding their own tolls and presenting their own dangers. The cost and risk of moving goods overland became too great. The caravans simply stopped coming. This teaches us a profound lesson about these trade arteries. They are not just roads on a map, they are living systems that require a specific environment to thrive. one of political stability, security, and predictable resources. When that environment fractures, the flow of life stops, and the heart of the route simply ceases to beat. This pattern of a thriving network falling into absolute silence was not unique to the desert. It happened with even more dramatic effect along a legendary sea route that once connected the Roman Empire to the riches of the East. The ghost of Muziris haunts a coastline that is now impossibly quiet. Roman merchants once risked the entire Indian Ocean to reach this single port, their ships heavy with gold and wine, destined to be exchanged for mountains of fragrant black pepper. This was not merely a market, it was a global crossroads celebrated in Roman ledgers and Tamil love poems alike. For centuries, it thrived as the definitive gateway between East and West. And then it was simply gone. By the 14th century, every map was blank where Muziris should have been. No grand ruin stood as a memorial. The earth itself seemed to have swallowed all traces. So how does a city of such immense wealth and renown vanish so completely? The evidence points to a devastating 1-2 punch of environmental and economic catastrophe. Geological studies suggest a massive flood event, possibly a cyclone or a tectonic shift that dramatically altered the course of the Periyar River. The very waterway that gave the port life may have silted up its harbor or submerged its waterfront warehouses, rendering it useless for ocean-going ships. But a natural disaster alone might not have been a death sentence. A resilient port could rebuild. The true collapse came from the other end of the trade route. The Roman Empire, Muziris's primary customer for 5 centuries, had fractured and declined. The constant flow of Roman gold, the lifeblood of this distant emporium, slowed to a trickle and then stopped entirely. With its economic reason for being severed, there was no will or wealth left to dredge the river or rebuild the docks. The city was abandoned, and the jungle quickly reclaimed the land. This is the fragile reality of a trade hub. Its existence is entirely borrowed. It lives only as long as the distant empires it connects remain stable and wealthy. When those empires vanish, their farthest outposts are the first to be erased, becoming little more than a name in an old poem. The silence that fell over Muziris makes us look inland to another type of waterway whose disappearance was just as profound. What happens when the rivers themselves, the original natural highways of civilization, are suddenly abandoned? Deep in the heart of the Sahara, the silence of the Garamantes is a different kind of mystery. Their story begins not with a bang, but with a whisper, the quiet drip of water in the dark. This civilization did not simply inhabit the desert, they conquered it, building a sprawling kingdom in what is now Libya by mastering a hidden resource. They constructed a vast, intricate network of underground tunnels known as fagaras that stretched for hundreds of miles. These were not simple wells, but subterranean rivers engineered by hand, designed to tap into ancient fossil water reserves locked deep beneath the sand. This was water that had fallen as rain thousands of years earlier, a non-renewable treasure from a forgotten age. With this lifeblood flowing through their fagaras, the Garamantes performed a miracle. They turned one of the most hostile environments on Earth into a green oasis, flourishing with wheat, dates, and grapes. Their granaries overflowed, making them a vital hub for caravans crossing the desert. They became the supermarket of the Sahara, their agricultural wealth fueling trade across a barren continent. So what happened? There was no dramatic invasion, no single cataclysm that shattered their cities. The end was a slow, relentless fade to silence. The very genius that built their civilization contained the seeds of its own destruction. Each tunnel, each field of crops was drawing down their precious fossil water, a bank account with no deposits. Generation after generation, the water table dropped, maintaining the fagaras became an endless, desperate struggle against collapsing tunnels and encroaching sand. At the same time, the trade routes that gave their surplus grain its value may have shifted, undermined by political changes or new maritime paths. The combination was fatal. Their agricultural engine sputtered and died, and without it, there was no reason to remain. The people gradually left, and the desert, patient and absolute, reclaimed its own. The story of the Garamantes is a stark lesson in environmental limits. It shows us that an empire can vanish not with a sword stroke, but with the last drop of water from a well that will never refill. This pattern of a civilization pushing its landscape too far echoes across history, raising a haunting question about the very ground beneath our feet. The lifeblood of the Bronze Age was not gold, but a far more crucial metal, tin. Without it, copper remained soft and malleable, but when combined, they created bronze, the alloy that gave an entire era its name and its edge. For over 1,000 years, a hidden network of trails crisscrossed Europe, moving this vital resource from the remote mines of places like Cornwall in Britain, all the way to the palaces of Mycenae and the workshops of the Eastern Mediterranean. This was not a single road, but a chain of trusted handoffs, a secretive and perilous overland journey that turned raw, dull ore into the sharpest swords and strongest tools of the ancient world. The tribes and chieftains who controlled segments of this route grew immensely wealthy, their power and culture built upon this steady flow of a single, indispensable commodity. And then, almost overnight, it was all over. The discovery of iron smelting changed everything. Iron ore was far more common than tin, and the metal it produced was harder, cheaper, and more versatile. The demand for bronze did not just decline, it utterly collapsed. Think of it like a global computer network suddenly rendered obsolete by a new, free, and superior technology. The value of the old system plummets to zero. The meticulously maintained tin routes fell into disuse. The merchants who knew the paths, the safe passes, and the secret fords found their specialized knowledge was now worthless. The cultures that had defined themselves by this trade, their entire economy and social structure woven around it, lost their reason for being. They did not just become poor, they faded into obscurity, their purpose erased by a technological shift they could not control. Where did the merchants go? Their guilds dissolved, their knowledge died with them. What happened to the chieftains who grew rich on tin? Their power evaporated, their grand hill forts were abandoned. The forgotten tin routes show us that an economic network, no matter how vast or vital, can be rendered completely obsolete, vanishing from memory as if it were a dream. This kind of quiet erasure by progress is one thing, but some of history's greatest trade arteries were severed by a far more violent and sudden hand. From the warm Baltic shores to the sun-baked Mediterranean, another artery pulsed with a golden treasure. For thousands of years, the Amber Road carried its namesake fossilized resin southward, a substance so prized it was found in the tomb of Tutankhamun. This was not a single paved highway, but a chain of river routes and forest trails, a living network that passed through countless tribal lands and, later, the northernmost reaches of the Roman Empire. Along this path, more than just amber traveled. Ideas, artisans, and entire belief systems moved with the precious cargo, connecting the distant corners of the ancient world in a continuous flow of commerce and culture. Then, in the space of a few generations, the flow stopped. The road did not crumble, the forests did not reclaim the paths overnight. Instead, the world around it shattered. The era of the Great Migrations, a time of vast, restless human movement, descended upon Europe. The stable borders and tacit agreements that had allowed a merchant to travel from the Baltic to the Adriatic with a pouch of raw amber simply evaporated. They were replaced by a landscape of constant, unpredictable warfare. The Hunnic invasions from the east acted like a hammer blow to this already fragile system, severing the delicate threads of trust and security that the road depended on. Why would a chieftain guarantee safe passage when his own village might be overrun next week? Where was the profit in luxury goods when survival was the only currency? The Amber Road teaches us that a trade route is a covenant of peace. It is a silent agreement between countless communities that the value of exchange is greater than the temptation of plunder. When that covenant is broken by widespread chaos, the road itself becomes a liability, a path of danger rather than opportunity. The golden thread was cut not by a lack of amber, but by a catastrophic lack of safety. This unraveling of order reveals a pattern, one where the collapse of a single empire can trigger a domino effect that silences the world. The most dangerous threat to a trade route is not a rival empire, but a silent, shifting sky. While kings and conquerors dominate the history books, it is often climate and catastrophe that deliver the final, decisive blow to a civilization's vital arteries. A prolonged drought does more than just wither crops. It desiccates an entire landscape, turning reliable rivers into dusty gullies and vital oases into death traps. For a caravan route, this is a death sentence. Without water for the animals and food for the merchants, the journey becomes impossible. But the collapse begins long before the last camel dies of thirst. The farming communities that line the route, the very populations that supply the caravans with food, water, and security, are the first to suffer. When their fields fail, they must abandon their homes. The support network for the trade route evaporates, leaving the path itself isolated and unsustainable. We see this tragic pattern etched into the ruins of the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia. This was one of the world's first great empires, a pioneer of bureaucracy and long-distance trade. Its power was built on the Fertile Crescent, a land of plenty. Then, around 4,200 years ago, a mega-drought of centuries-long proportions gripped the region. The evidence is locked in ancient mud and seafloor sediments, telling a story of sudden, extreme aridity. The agricultural system that fed the cities and supported the trade networks collapsed. Without a surplus of grain and goods to move, the economic engine of the empire seized. Trade caravans would have arrived in bustling cities only to find empty markets and desperate people. The intricate web of exchange that held the empire together frayed and then snapped. This was not a slow decline. It was a systemic failure triggered by an environmental shock the Akkadians could neither predict nor prevent. In the Mediterranean, a single, terrifying day can accomplish what centuries of warfare cannot. The cataclysmic eruption of the volcano Thera around the year 1600 BC did not just bury a city, it likely crippled an entire maritime civilization. The Minoans of Crete were the masters of the eastern Mediterranean, their sleek ships dominating sea lanes and their trade networks reaching from Egypt to the Aegean. The eruption was one of the largest in human history. It would have generated colossal tsunamis that smashed into the Minoan fleet and port facilities, wiping out their primary means of commerce in a few horrifying hours. The subsequent ashfall would have blanketed their islands, smothering farmlands for a generation and triggering a volcanic winter. How do you rebuild a trade empire when your ships are splinters, your harbors are wrecked, and your people are starving? The Minoan sea lanes, once buzzing with activity, fell into a silence from which they never recovered. These stories reveal a brutal truth. A trade artery is a system built for predictability. It assumes the river will flow where it always has, the monsoon winds will arrive on schedule, and the harvest will be sufficient. When a climate shifts or a catastrophe strikes, that foundational predictability vanishes. A river changes course and a port city is left stranded inland. A harbor silts up and the deep-drafted ships of a global power can no longer dock. The empire's economic heart stops beating not because of a foreign invasion, but because the very environment that nurtured it has turned hostile. This environmental perspective forces us to look beyond kings and battles, to the fragile relationship between human ambition and the power of the planet itself. It raises a chilling question about the ingenuity required to survive such shocks, and what happens when that ingenuity is not enough. Somewhere along the swampy coast of Tanzania, a city that should be there has simply disappeared from the face of the earth. Ancient texts speak with certainty of Rhapta, a bustling East African metropolis described by Greek and Roman geographers as the southernmost emporium of the known world. Its merchants traded in the most exotic commodities imaginable: ivory tusks of enormous size, gleaming tortoise shell, and the coveted horns of rhinoceroses, all destined for the workshops and noble villas of the Roman Empire. For centuries, it was a fixed point on the mental map of the ancient world, a final, glittering outpost before the map faded into terra incognita, and then it was gone. No crumbling walls, no pottery shards littering a recognizable harbor, not a single inscription has been definitively tied to its location. It is a ghost in the historical record, a place that logic says must exist, yet the ground refuses to yield its secrets. So how does an entire city vanish so completely that it becomes a legend? The answer lies in the fragile nature of its very existence. Rhapta was not a capital of a mighty inland kingdom. It was a creation of trade, a peripheral node whose life was borrowed from a distant, powerful heart. Its purpose was to feed the Roman appetite for luxury. When that appetite waned with the empire's own fragmentation and decline, the lifeblood of gold and goods that sustained Rhapta dried up. Why would a merchant risk the treacherous monsoon sailing to a distant shore if there was no one left to buy his cargo? The economic reason for the cities being evaporated. But the environment may have delivered the final, silencing blow. The coast of East Africa is geologically active, and evidence points to significant changes in sea level over the centuries. It is entirely possible that the very wharves and warehouses of Rhapta, the heart of its commercial power, now lie submerged beneath the waves, slowly buried by silt and sand. Alternatively, a shift in the very monsoon winds that sailors meticulously followed could have made the journey too unpredictable or dangerous, isolating the city long before the last Roman coin was spent. Rhapta's fate is a stark lesson in dependency. It teaches us that the most vibrant trading hub can be nothing more than a reflection in the water, its existence entirely contingent on the stability and wealth of a far-off core. When the core collapses, the reflection shatters, and the periphery vanishes back into the jungle and the sea, leaving behind only a name on a faded parchment and a mystery that challenges our understanding of how the world was once connected. The scent of unimaginable wealth once drifted on the desert wind. Long before ships mastered the monsoon, the true treasures of the ancient world, frankincense and myrrh, traveled overland on a network of trails etched across the Arabian Peninsula. These resins, harvested from scraggly trees in southern Arabia, were more valuable than gold, essential for religious rituals, royal ceremonies, and medicines from the Nile to the Euphrates. The cities that controlled this flow of incense became legends. Petra, with its tombs carved into rose-red cliffs, was not just a city of the dead, but a living, breathing customs house, its wealth siphoned from every camel train that passed through its narrow sick. Farther north, Palmyra's grand colonnades and towering temples were monuments to trade, paid for by the taxes on this fragrant commerce. These were not just cities, they were brilliant middlemen in one of history's most lucrative businesses. So how could such a profitable and established system simply evaporate? The answer was not an invasion, but an innovation happening just to the west. The Roman Empire's conquest of Egypt was a turning point. With the Nile under their control, the Romans aggressively developed maritime routes through the Red Sea. A merchant could now load a ship with 100 times the cargo of a camel caravan and sail directly to the source, bypassing the desert and its endless chain of tolls and tariffs. The overland journey, with its months of hardship and danger, suddenly became an expensive anachronism. The demand for incense did not disappear, but the route to supply it did. And with the routes abandoned, something strange and profound happened. The specialized knowledge that had sustained the trail for over 1,000 years vanished within a few generations. The locations of secret desert wells, the landmarks visible only to a trained eye, the safe paths through shifting dunes, this was all hard-won intelligence that died with the last caravan masters. The cities that had been oases of commerce did not just become poor, they became incomprehensible. Their grand architecture, built for a purpose that no longer existed, stood as a riddle to those who came after. The sands did not just bury the physical trail, they buried the very memory of how it worked. This is the ultimate fate of a trade artery made obsolete. It is not merely abandoned, it is forgotten, its logic erased by a more efficient competitor, leaving only silent stones in the desert to whisper of a world that once moved to the rhythm of camels and the smell of sacred smoke. A single Roman coin found in the soil of southern India speaks volumes. It is a solitary data point that, when connected to others, begins to trace the ghostly outline of a route long vanished. Uncovering these forgotten trade arteries is the work of modern archaeological detectives, scientists who use tools the original merchants could never have conceived. They scan satellite imagery, seeing what the human eye on the ground cannot, to spot the faint scars of ancient trackways and the geometric shadows of buried foundations. They analyze the very chemistry of the soil, detecting the unique residues of spices, oils, or industrial activity that mark the site of a long-vanished marketplace. And from deep within sediment cores, they extract ancient pollen grains, using them to reconstruct the environment of a world that once was green and fertile. Each of these techniques is a different kind of clue in a massive historical puzzle. The widespread discovery of a specific type of pottery, its clay sourced to a single region, can map a trade network's reach as clearly as any ancient ledger. A handful of peppercorns preserved in an Egyptian port, far from their native home, confirms the reality of a spice route described only in poems. This scientific sleuthing is a painstaking process of connecting dots across continents and centuries. It allows us to slowly piece together the map of a lost world, revealing the incredible distances goods traveled and the profound complexity of ancient economies that rivaled our own in their global reach. We are not just finding artifacts, we are listening to them. Each shard of pottery, each coin, each microscopic grain of pollen has a story to tell about connection, about exchange, and about the moment that connection was severed. The evidence we unearth slowly brings these silent highways back to life, allowing us to hear their stories once more. But what is the ultimate value of listening to these echoes from a silent past? Why does the fate of a trade route that collapsed 2,000 years ago matter to us today? The ocean holds its secrets close, and none are more profound than the silence that fell over the fleets of Srivijaya. This was a kingdom built not on land, but on water, a thalassocracy whose power flowed from its absolute command of the Strait of Malacca. For over 600 years, every ship moving between the economic titans of China and India had to pass through this narrow channel, and the Srivijayan Empire was the tollkeeper, its wealth and influence extracted from the waves. Their ports were bustling, cosmopolitan hubs where Chinese porcelain met Indian textiles, and their navy was the undisputed master of these seas. Yet today, finding the physical remains of their grand capital is a monumental challenge, with much of it believed to lie buried under river silt or submerged beneath the waves. So what could possibly dismantle such a formidable maritime power? The answer is not one single event, but a convergence of pressures that shattered its economic model. A series of naval raids from the aggressive Chola dynasty of southern India delivered a sharp, destabilizing blow, demonstrating that Srivijayan waters were no longer a secure domain. More critically, the very geography that gave them power began to turn against them. The Musi River, the lifeblood of their port cities, slowly choked itself with silt, rendering the harbors too shallow for the deep-drafted trading vessels of the age. The empire was literally being strangled by the land, but the final, decisive shift was economic. The rise of the Song dynasty in China championed a new era of direct, long-distance maritime trade. Chinese merchants building larger and more resilient ships began sailing past the Malacca Strait entirely, dealing directly with producers in India and the Middle East. Why pay a middleman when you could go straight to the source? The strategic chokehold that was the source of all Srivijayan wealth was broken, its purpose evaporated. The fleet, once the symbol of its dominance, had no one left to police and no goods left to protect. It was not defeated in a great, final battle, but simply rotted away in useless ports, its sailors and merchants dispersing to find new livelihoods. The empire did not fall with a bang, but with a whisper, its network of influence dissolving into the humid air, leaving behind only its name in a few scattered chronicles and a mystery lying just beneath the silt. The desert still remembers the tread of 1,000 camels. For centuries, the great Trans-Saharan caravans were the only link between two worlds, a moving river of commerce and culture under the blistering sun. These were not small groups of travelers, but vast processions, sometimes including 10,000 camels, each animal laden with salt bars from the north, heading south to be exchanged for a treasure the Mediterranean world craved above all else: gold. This exchange built empires in the West African savanna like Ghana and Mali, whose rulers became proverbial for their wealth. Their most famous city, Timbuktu, was not just a market of unimaginable riches, but a beacon of scholarship, its libraries filled with manuscripts on astronomy, law, and medicine, all funded by the golden trade. The entire system was a masterpiece of human adaptation, reliant on the specialized knowledge of Tuareg guides. These masters of the desert could navigate an ocean of sand using the stars, reading subtle shifts in the dune patterns and knowing the location of every critical, hidden oasis. The survival of every merchant, every slave, every ounce of gold depended on this hard-won intelligence passed down through generations. So why would such a complex and deeply rooted network, the very foundation of empires, ever be abandoned? The answer arrived not from the desert but from the sea. In the 15th century, Portuguese caravels began appearing along the West African coast. These ships offered a direct route to the source. Why spend months on a perilous desert crossing, risking thirst, bandits, and sandstorms, when a European ship could load the gold at the source and sail it directly to Lisbon or Genoa? The economic calculation was brutal and undeniable. The sea route was simply cheaper, faster, and safer. The overland gold trade did not vanish overnight. It entered a long, slow decline, like a great beast bleeding out from a wound it could not see. As the flow of gold dwindled, the caravans grew smaller and less frequent. The cultural cost of this shift was catastrophic. The intricate knowledge of the desert crossings, the precise locations of life-saving water holes, the social agreements with different tribes for safe passage, this vast library of practical wisdom began to fade from memory. What use is a star chart for a desert nobody travels? Why maintain a network of oasis wells for caravans that no longer come? The city of Timbuktu, its economic reason for being severed, slowly transformed from a cosmopolitan center of global exchange into a remote, isolated town, its legendary wealth and learning fading into myth. This was not a dramatic collapse wrought by war or plague, but something far more insidious, a slow death by economic obsolescence. The Sahara's golden highways were not destroyed, they were simply rendered redundant, proving that the most established route can be erased not by a desert's hostility, but by the calm efficiency of a new technology on the horizon. That specialized knowledge was a merchant's most guarded treasure. It was not found in any ledger or carved on any temple wall, but carried in the memory of a single person, a living, breathing database of risks and opportunities. A Phoenician sailor did not have a chart of the Mediterranean. He had the feel of a particular current against the hull and the specific shade of blue over a submerged reef. He knew which hidden inlet offered fresh water and which was a trap for pirates. A Silk Road merchant carried a mental map of trust and danger, knowing that the chieftain of one valley demanded silver for safe passage, while the leader of the next mountain pass preferred bolts of fine silk. This was intelligence gathered over a lifetime, often at the cost of great personal risk, and it was passed down carefully from an experienced master to a trusted apprentice through stories told around campfires and quiet advice given during long, monotonous journeys. This entire system of learning was built on continuity. It required a steady stream of caravans and a predictable world where the same tribal agreements held for generations. When that world shattered, when the caravan stopped and the ports fell silent, the chain was broken. The master died without an apprentice to teach, and the knowledge died with him. The location of that life-saving desert well was forgotten. The secret signal used to contact a friendly tribe in a distant land faded from memory. The subtle shift in the wind that signaled the end of the monsoon season was no longer recognized. This was a catastrophic data loss on a continental scale. The collapse of an empire was not just the fall of a palace or the scattering of an army. It was the dissolution of a human network, the permanent silencing of 10,000 individual voices, each holding one small, essential piece of a puzzle that had once connected the world. We can unearth their pottery and trace their coins, but we can never recover the whispered warning that saved a caravan or the song a sailor sang to navigate by the stars. That is the true, profound silence left behind when empires vanish, the echo of a million lost conversations that once made the world feel whole. The intricate stone faces of Angkor Wat have watched over a silent jungle for centuries, but they once overlooked a city pulsing with life, a metropolis powered by water. The Khmer Empire was a hydraulic civilization, its heart beating not in a palace but within a vast man-made network of canals, reservoirs, and redirected rivers. This system was a masterpiece of engineering, far more than just a way to water rice paddies. These waterways were the empire's liquid highways. Massive stone blocks, quarried from mountains dozens of miles away, were floated on barges through this network to construct the breathtaking temples that still stand today. These same channels moved troops to distant frontiers and carried the harvests from fertile fields to feed a population of perhaps 1 million people. The entire sprawling capital of Angkor was a machine designed to capture, store, and distribute water, the ultimate source of its power and grandeur. So what could cause such a meticulously planned city to be gradually abandoned? Its population drifting away until the jungle reclaimed its streets. the answer appears to be a catastrophic failure of the very system that defined it. Recent analysis of tree rings from the region reveals a terrifying pattern of climate volatility. A series of intense, prolonged droughts would have strained the massive reservoirs, lowering their levels to a critical point. This was followed by periods of exceptionally heavy monsoon rains, delivering more water than the carefully calibrated canals and spillways were designed to handle. The empire's brilliant hydraulic network, built for a stable climate, was being hammered by a 1-2 punch of drought and deluge. Canals silted up, reservoirs were breached, and the delicate balance between too little and too much water was shattered. This environmental stress alone would have caused famine and social unrest, but another, quieter shift was happening simultaneously. While Anchor's engineers were battling failing waterways, the global currents of commerce were changing. The rise of maritime trade, centered on powerful port cities like Malacca, offered a new and more efficient route for moving goods across Southeast Asia. Why transport heavy cargo overland and along vulnerable river systems when a ship could carry it faster and cheaper? The Khmer Empire, an inland power, found its economic relevance slowly eroding. The lifeblood of trade began to bypass its heartland. The combination proved fatal. A capital city with a broken water system and a fading economic purpose is a city living on borrowed time. The people did not vanish, but they did make a rational choice. They gradually moved to new, more viable locations near the coast, following the opportunities that their grand stone city could no longer provide. The jungle did not conquer Anchor in a sudden attack. It simply walked in through the front door after the last caretaker had left, a quiet testament to the fact that even the most magnificent infrastructure can become a monument to a world that has moved on. The great mounds of Cahokia rise from the Illinois floodplain like silent, earthen pyramids. For centuries, they overlooked a city that rivaled any in medieval Europe, a bustling metropolis of perhaps 20,000 people, all sustained by a riverine trade network that spanned the continent. Long before European ships ever touched American shores, goods were flowing along the Mississippi and its tributaries in a constant, vibrant exchange. Copper from the distant shores of Lake Superior was hammered into ceremonial ornaments. Gleaming sheets of mica were quarried from the Appalachian Mountains and transported hundreds of miles to be cut into intricate shapes. Seashells from the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico were carved into sacred cups and beads, finding their way to northern cities. Cahokia sat at the very heart of this system, a cosmic crossroads where the paths of the continent met. Its central plaza, overshadowed by the colossal Monk's Mound, would have been a cacophony of different languages, a marketplace where a hunter from the north could barter a bearskin for a string of Gulf Coast pearls. This was a world of profound complexity and connection, entirely of its own making. So why, by the time Spanish explorers like Hernando de Soto began charting the river in the 16th century, were these great centers empty, their grand plazas silent and overgrown? The great mystery of the mound builders is not that they existed, but that they vanished just as Europe arrived. The evidence points to a perfect storm of internal and external pressures. A prolonged period of favorable climate, known as the medieval warm period, had initially boosted maize agriculture, allowing populations to boom and cities like Cahokia to flourish. But when the climate shifted to the cooler, more volatile Little Ice Age, crop yields would have become unpredictable. A single bad harvest in a city of 20,000 is a crisis. 3 in a row is a catastrophe. This environmental stress likely triggered social unrest and a loss of faith in the ruling priests and chieftains whose power was tied to their ability to ensure a good harvest. But another invisible traveler was already moving down the trade routes. European diseases like smallpox and measles, introduced by early contacts along the Gulf Coast, raced ahead of the explorers themselves. These illnesses would have been a biological wildfire in a population with no immunity, devastating communities and severing the human links that held the trade network together. A master shell carver dies before teaching his apprentice. A trader who knew the safe passage up the Tennessee River succumbs in his village. The death of a single person is a tragedy. The death of a generation's specialized knowledge is the death of a civilization. The mounds, therefore, are not just monuments to a lost people. They are tombstones for a network that collapsed from within, even as it was being attacked from without by forces its people could not see or comprehend. Their silence is a powerful testament to a simple, haunting truth that a world can end long before anyone from the outside even knows it was there. Their faces tell a story the history books forgot. In the parched sands of China's Tarim Basin, archaeologists uncovered mummies with startlingly European features, individuals with brown hair, long noses, and tall frames, preserved for thousands of years by the dry desert air. They were not lost travelers but a settled people, buried with the tools of their daily lives and clad in beautifully woven woolen textiles, some even wearing tall, pointed hats that would not look out of place in the European Bronze Age. These were the people of a lost northern branch of the Silk Road, a route that skirted the deadly Taklamakan Desert along its northern rim. Their very existence, dating back as far as 4,000 years, rewrites our entire timeline. This was not a route created by the Han Chinese or the Roman empires. This was a vibrant, ancient network of exchange that thrived a full 2,000 years before the classical Silk Road we know from the history books was ever established. Here was a sophisticated culture, connected to worlds we never knew were linked, moving goods and ideas across staggering distances in an era we once thought was defined by isolation. So what became of them? The mystery of their disappearance is as profound as their presence. The climate of the Tarim Basin is unforgiving, and these communities were utterly dependent on oasis water fed by glacial melt from the surrounding mountains. A prolonged shift in climate patterns, a slow drying over centuries, could have starved these oases, turning fertile pockets of life back into barren desert. When the water vanishes, the people must follow. Alternatively, they may not have vanished at all, but were gradually absorbed. Later waves of migration, including the eastward movement of Indo-European speaking peoples like the Tocharians, could have assimilated this unique population, their distinct genetic and cultural identity slowly blending into the larger tapestry of Central Asian history. The silence that fell over their specific branch of the route was likely a quiet one, a slow fading rather than a dramatic collapse. Their story forces us to confront a humbling truth. The trade arteries we so often study, the ones tied to famous empires, are merely the most recent chapters in a much longer story of human connection. Long before Rome or Chang'an were capitals, people were undertaking epic journeys, weaving a web of exchange that stretched across the planet. An entire branch of a global network, with its own cultures, languages, and technologies, can flourish and then be completely erased from human memory, leaving only its dead to whisper the truth from the sand. If an entire highway of human contact could be so utterly forgotten, what other lost connections lie buried, waiting to tell us their story? The silence of an abandoned port echoes far beyond its empty docks. When a major trade artery collapsed, the shockwave traveled along every connected path, crippling economies thousands of miles from the original rupture. A bustling port city did not die alone. Its sudden decline meant hunger for the inland farmers who had spent generations cultivating grain specifically for export. It meant bankruptcy for the potters whose distinct style of amphory were now useless. designed for a ship that would never sail again. The entire regional ecosystem, a complex web of specialized labor built around that single hub, unraveled in a devastatingly short time. Consider the intricate tin routes of the Bronze Age. The disappearance of that single commodity did not just mean a shortage of luxury items. It meant a sudden, catastrophic shortage of bronze itself, the essential material for weapons, tools, and societal function. Armies found they could no longer equip their soldiers. Farmers struggled to repair their plows. This was not a slow transition. It was a systemic economic heart attack that forced societies to either adapt rapidly to the new technology of iron or face a period of stark regression. The reach of this domino effect was truly global. When the Roman Empire's demand for silks, spices, and incense finally waned, the economic depression rippled all the way back to the source. Workshops in India that had loomed silk for centuries saw their orders cancelled. Pepper plantations in southern India that had shaped their entire landscape around export were suddenly growing a crop nobody could afford to buy. The Roman fiscal crisis became a Chinese and Indian recession, a stark reminder of ancient globalization. This interconnectedness meant the failure of one critical link placed unbearable strain on the entire chain. Local economies that had honed specific, valuable skills for generations were rendered obsolete overnight. A family lineage of camel breeders would find their prized animals were now just a source of meat. The guild of shipwrights who knew the precise way to seal a hull for the monsoon voyage saw their shipyards fall silent. The economic collapse for these individuals was not slow or theoretical. It was a swift and personal catastrophe. The political entity, the empire itself, might have taken decades or even centuries to fully disintegrate, but for the merchant, the artisan, and the farmer whose lives were tied to the pulse of commerce, the end came with the season when the caravans did not return. This sudden economic death is the quiet, human tragedy behind every vanished empire, a lesson in the fragile dependency that binds us all. A river of silver once flowed north from the palaces of Baghdad, its current powered by the oars of Viking longboats. These Scandinavian traders, master navigators of both sea and river, carved a daring route straight through the heart of Russia. They portaged their ships between the Volga and Dnieper rivers, a grueling overland effort to connect the Baltic Sea with the Caspian and ultimately the wealthy markets of the Islamic Caliphate. Their longships returning home were heavy with Islamic silver coins called dirhams, so many that thousands of these coins are still unearthed in Scandinavian soil today, a glittering testament to a trade route that functioned for centuries. Then the flow of silver ceased, the longboats stopped making the arduous journey, so what could silence such a profitable and well-established artery? The answer lies in a perfect storm of geopolitical and economic shifts far from the Viking homelands. The consolidation of the Kievan Rus state was a double-edged sword. While it initially provided a framework for trade, a stronger, more centralized Kiev began to exert greater control, demanding higher taxes and tolls from the passing merchant fleets. This squeezed the profit margins for the Norse traders, making the long, dangerous journey less worthwhile. At the same time, the source of the silver itself began to dry up. Political instability and the exhaustion of key mines in the Islamic world, particularly in Central Asia, led to a widespread shortage of new silver coinage. The economic lifeblood of the entire northern route was simply no longer being produced in the same quantities, but perhaps the final, decisive blow came from the south. The Crusades, beginning at the end of the 11th century, and the concurrent rise of powerful Italian maritime republics like Venice and Genoa, fundamentally rerouted Eurasian trade. They established new, secure sea lanes across the Mediterranean, connecting Europe directly to the Middle East and the riches of the Silk Road's western terminus. Why would a merchant in Constantinople or Baghdad bother with a risky, expensive northern river route when he could ship his goods directly to an Italian port? The Viking route was not destroyed by invasion or natural disaster. It was made obsolete, rendered a costly and inefficient detour in a world that had found a better way. The silence that fell along the Russian rivers was not the silence of defeat, but the quiet of abandonment, a forgotten highway bypassed by the new currents of global commerce. A single, deep blue stone in an Egyptian pharaoh's tomb contains a mystery spanning 6,000 years. Lapis lazuli, mined from a single remote source in the mountains of Afghanistan, was one of the ancient world's most persistent treasures. For millennia, a dedicated overland route carried this vibrant blue stone across the harsh Iranian plateau, delivering it to the workshops of Sumerian jewelers and the mortuary temples of the Nile. The sheer longevity of this trade is staggering, outlasting empires and entire languages. Yet its true mystery lies not in its endurance, but in its strange, periodic silences. During eras of catastrophic upheaval, like the sweeping campaigns of Alexander the Great or the brutal Mongol conquests, the intricate knowledge of this specific pathway would vanish. The locations of way stations, the agreements with mountain tribes for safe passage, the precise methods for transporting the heavy, rough stone, this entire operational manual could be lost for generations. The route did not merely become dangerous, it was forgotten, falling into a deep dormancy. How could something so valuable simply be misplaced? The answer is that a trade route is a living library of practical knowledge, and when its librarians are scattered or killed, the books are effectively burned. The stone itself, however, held the memory. A lapis lazuli scarab sealed in a tomb, a blue inlay in a Mesopotamian crown. These finished objects became the only keepers of the secret. They were the proof that the connection had once existed, silent ambassadors from a lost highway, waiting in the dark for a time when stability would return, and a new generation of merchants could, by studying these very artifacts, piece the route back together again. This cycle of dormancy and rediscovery reveals a profound truth, that the most resilient trade arteries were not those that never faltered, but those whose memory was preserved in the value of what they carried, sleeping until the world was safe enough for them to breathe once more. The rivers of Dvaravati once hummed with a distinct cultural melody. Across what is now Thailand from the 6th to the 11th centuries, the Mon people built a kingdom not of grand conquests but of quiet commercial genius. Their cities were not fortresses but hubs, strategically placed along a web of natural rivers and hand-dug canals that formed a liquid highway between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. This was a crossroads of continents, and the proof is etched into the very artifacts they left behind. Their sculptures of the Buddha bear the graceful, spiritual marks of Indian artistry, and their distinctive silver coins, stamped with symbols of wealth and sovereignty, circulated through a world far larger than their own. Dvaravati was a land profoundly connected, a vital link in a chain of exchange that stretched for thousands of miles. So why did its cities gradually empty, their bustling ports falling into a silence so deep that the jungle could reclaim them? The answer appears to be a slow, strategic strangulation. From the east, the rising power of the Khmer Empire began to exert immense pressure. As Angkor grew in military and economic might, it likely began to dominate and redirect trade routes that had once flowed freely through Dvaravati's channels. But a more profound shift was happening on the water. The strategic importance of the Strait of Malacca was growing exponentially. New maritime technologies and larger ships made it more efficient for traders to sail directly through this narrow passage, connecting China and India without needing to navigate the complex and slower riverine networks of the mainland. Why transfer cargo from a deep-sea vessel to a fleet of smaller river barges, dealing with multiple tolls and delays when you could sail straight to your destination? The economic logic became undeniable. Dvaravati's entire reason for being was its position as a necessary middleman, and when the world found a way to bypass the middleman, its purpose evaporated. The kingdom did not fall in a dramatic siege, it simply faded, its vibrant river network growing quiet as the main currents of global trade charted a new, more efficient course elsewhere. The stones of its overgrown cities are not just ruins, they are a monument to a harsh economic truth that a network is only as strong as its necessity. The word sugar on your tongue carries the echo of a 1,000-year-old journey. It began as Sahara in ancient Sanskrit, transformed into Sakar as Arab merchants carried it west, and finally entered English as sugar, a permanent linguistic fossil of a trade route that has long since turned to dust. This is the ghost in the machine of history, the cultural DNA that outlasts empires. Long after the last camel train vanished into the desert, the words for the goods they carried remained, woven into the fabric of our daily speech. Orange from the Persian narang, musk from the Sanskrit muska, even the humble check, a word for a financial instrument, traces back to the Persian Shah, a king, used on a chessboard to declare a threat and later on a bill of exchange to certify a payment. These are not just words, they are unbreakable threads connecting us to a past we thought was lost. But language was only the beginning. The real cargo moving along these arteries was often intangible, yet it reshaped civilizations. A new rhythm would arrive with a traveling musician, a strange stringed instrument from a distant land finding a home in a new culture and evolving into something entirely unique. A story told around a campfire under foreign stars would slowly morph, its characters and morals adapting, until it became a foundational myth for a people who had never seen its land of origin. The most profound traveler of all was faith. The peaceful march of Buddhism from the groves of India, across the towering Pamir Mountains, and into the heart of China, and beyond was a journey made possible exclusively by the merchants and mendicants who walked the Silk Road. They did not carry statues or holy texts at first, but ideas, carried in memory and expressed in art, leaving behind the serene faces of the Buddha carved into the cliffs of Bamiyan, a silent sermon for passing caravans. These cultural artifacts are the true, lasting legacy of the connection. The empires that policed the routes are gone, their palaces are rubble. The merchants who bartered for profit are dust, their ledgers disintegrated. But the idea they carried, the musical scale they introduced, the story they told, these have a life of their own. They are the clues that, even in the deepest silence, a vibrant dialogue once occurred across continents. By studying these footprints, by listening to the loanwords in our language and tracing the stylistic shifts in ancient art, we can reconstruct a map of human interaction that no parchment could ever hold. This evidence proves a remarkable truth that while stone roads can be buried and ports can be submerged, the exchange of ideas possesses a strange and powerful permanence, a whisper that somehow outshouts the fall of kingdoms. Deep within the archives of the Mycenaean palaces, clay tablets hardened by fire tell a story of meticulous control. At Pylos and Mycenae, scribes used a script called Linear B to record every jar of olive oil, every measure of bronze, every textile in the palace storerooms. This was not a market economy, it was a command system where the palace was the central processor for all wealth, directing the production of perfumed oil and fine pottery for export across the Mediterranean. Their galleys carried these goods to Egypt, to Anatolia, and to other palatial centers, bringing back the raw materials and luxuries that fueled their power. This intricate, centralized network was the very heart of their civilization, and then the heart stopped beating. Around 1200 BCE, the palaces did not just fall into decline, they were violently destroyed, burned to the ground in a wave of conflagrations that left their clay records baked into permanence. The system shattered completely, so what could cause such a sudden and total failure? The evidence points not to a single enemy, but to a cascade of crises, a perfect storm that overwhelmed their complex world. A prolonged period of drought and climate instability, confirmed by tree ring studies, would have led to crop failure and famine, straining the social contract between the ruling Wanax or king and the people. At the same time, the entire Eastern Mediterranean trade network, upon which the palaces depended for tin and other essentials, was itself unraveling, likely due to the disruptions caused by the mysterious sea peoples. This was a double blow: internal stress and external collapse. The result was a systems failure. The centralized palace, so brilliant at managing prosperity, was utterly fragile in the face of simultaneous shocks. When the grain stores ran out and the trade routes were cut, the authority of the king evaporated. The people may have risen in rebellion or simply scattered to survive. The final, chilling consequence was the loss of knowledge itself. With the palaces gone, the need for linear vanished. The scribes and their specialized skill died out. Greece was plunged into a dark age, a centuries-long silence where the very memory of palatial administration, of long-distance trade, and of writing was erased. The collapse of the Mycenaean trade network was not merely an economic event. It was a civilizational reset, proving that when the arteries of exchange are severed, the brain of the civilization can be erased with them. A caravan master's song is a map you cannot hold in your hands. For centuries, the great salt roads of the Sahara were navigated by such songs, their rhythms and lyrics encoding the locations of hidden wells, the shapes of specific dune formations, and the stories of ancestors who had traveled the same path. This was a world built on the exchange of two elemental treasures, from the blistering salt mines of Tagheza, where buildings were carved from salt blocks and the very air stung the lungs. Immense slabs of white salt were loaded onto camels. This was not a luxury but a biological necessity. In the hot, humid climates of West Africa, salt was the only means of preserving food and replacing vital minerals lost to sweat. Its value was so immense that, pound for pound, it was traded directly for gold. The southbound camels carried salt, and the northbound camels carried gold dust, a direct exchange of desert for forest, of necessity for wealth. This was the economic engine that powered empires like Ghana and Mali, a continuous flow of life and luxury across the world's most formidable desert. So how could such a fundamental and deeply rooted system fade into near obscurity? The shift did not come from within the desert, but from its edges. The arrival of European ships along the West African coast offered a new, devastatingly efficient alternative. Why would a merchant in Timbuktu pay a premium for salt that had been hauled for 2 months across 1,000 miles of sand, when a ship could deliver a shipload of sea salt to a coastal port at a fraction of the cost and risk? The economic logic was brutal and inescapable. Later, the drawing of colonial boundaries by European powers further fractured the old Trans-Saharan world, imposing artificial borders that disrupted the free movement of caravans and the social agreements that had governed the trade for a millennium. The Grand Network did not collapse in a day, but it dwindled, its vast river of commerce shrinking to a trickle, and with its decline, an entire cultural universe began to vanish. The specific songs that guided the caravans lost their purpose, their melodies fading from memory. The intricate social protocols for negotiating with different tribes, the secret hand signals between traders, the ceremonial greetings at each oasis, this vast and sophisticated library of unwritten knowledge was rendered obsolete. The true mystery of the salt roads is not the disappearance of the trade itself, but the silencing of the unique human world that grew up around it. While small salt caravans still operate today, the empire-shaping network is a ghost, its memory now held in the fragile oral histories of the Tuareg people, a whispered echo of a time when the desert moved to the rhythm of camels and the value of a song was beyond any price. Their ships were the ghosts of the Mediterranean, appearing on the horizon without warning. The Phoenicians were not just sailors, they were the supreme information brokers of the ancient world, and their most valuable asset was a secret they carried in their heads. They dominated the Bronze Age economy by controlling the source of tin, the indispensable ingredient for making bronze itself. While others bartered for the finished metal, the Phoenicians went straight to the source, all the way to the remote, fog-shrouded islands of Britain. Their route there was a state secret more protected than any royal treasure. They did not have maps, they had memory, a living, breathing database of celestial navigation passed from captain to son. They read the subtle shifts in ocean currents, the specific behavior of seabirds, and the color of the water to find their way across the treacherous Atlantic swell. They knew the locations of hidden coves along the coast of Iberia, safe harbors where they could repair their ships and take on fresh water without attracting the attention of local tribes. These way stations were the invisible stepping stones of their monopoly. So what happened to this incredibly profitable highway? The Phoenician civilization did not end in a single, fiery collapse. It was gradually absorbed first by the rising power of Persia and then decisively by the Roman war machine. When the great port city of Carthage was razed to the ground, it was not just a city that was destroyed. It was a corporate headquarters, and with it died the proprietary intelligence of an entire global operation. The Romans, brilliant engineers of roads, were not the same masters of the open ocean. They inherited a vast empire but lost the detailed, experiential knowledge of how to sail to Britain for tin. Why would a Roman merchant risk a journey into the unknown Atlantic when he could simply tax the overland routes he already controlled? The specialized skill of that specific voyage was no longer cultivated. The sea lanes did not vanish from the earth, but the precise, efficient, and secret path that the Phoenicians had perfected simply faded from human knowledge, becoming little more than a legend. This reveals a chilling vulnerability in a trade network. When an artery is built not on public infrastructure, but on the private, guarded expertise of a few, its survival is tied to the survival of that specific culture. Silence their voices and you silence the route itself, leaving only the waves crashing against shores that once knew their keels all too well. A different kind of spice route once threaded through the emerald jungles of Yunnan. Long before Chinese junks dominated the South China Sea, the demand for the cloves of the Moluccas and the nutmeg of the Banda Islands created an incredible overland pathway. This was not a road of stone and caravanserais, but a chain of narrow trails, navigated by local tribes who knew how to cross the treacherous, earthquake-prone mountains separating Burma from southern China. Their porters carried bundles of fragrant spices that had already traveled by native outrigger from the distant Spice Islands, beginning a second, even more perilous leg of their journey north. This land route was a critical, early link, feeding the luxury tastes of the Tang and Song dynasties and connecting the maritime world of Southeast Asia directly to the sprawling continental network of the Silk Road. So why would such a vital connection be severed? The answer is a story of pure economic calculus. the development of massive ocean-going junks during the Song dynasty changed everything. A single ship could now carry the cargo of 1,000 porters. It could sail with the monsoon winds directly from the Spice Islands to the great ports of southern China like Guangzhou and Quanzhou, a journey measured in weeks, not months. Why would a merchant pay a fortune to have his spices hauled over landslide-prone mountain passes, through territory controlled by countless different tribes, each demanding their own toll, when he could ship them all together in one relatively safe, predictable maritime voyage? The overland route did not vanish in a dramatic collapse. It was simply outcompeted. The caravans grew smaller each year, the trails less maintained. The specialized knowledge of the mountain passes, which families had guarded for generations, slowly lost its value. The jungle, always waiting at the edges, did not need to conquer the path. It simply stepped in as the last porter walked away, swallowing the route whole until no sign of it remained. This quiet abandonment is a powerful testament to a recurring pattern in history, where the relentless pursuit of efficiency can erase a world of human endeavor from the map, leaving only the whisper of nutmeg on the wind to mark where a continent was once connected. Some locations are born with a target on their back, a narrow strait, a slender isthmus, a single viable pass through a wall of mountains. These geographical quirks become irresistible magnets for power. To control one was to hold a knife to the throat of global commerce, to tax every dream of wealth moving between continents. The story of Constantinople is the ultimate lesson in this brutal geography. For 1,000 years, it was the golden choke point, the one city that sat squarely on the only sea route connecting the rich Mediterranean to the spice markets of the East. Every Venetian galley, every caravan of silk had to pass beneath its walls, filling its coffers with a continuous river of gold. Its power was not just in its legions, but in its location. And then the world changed. The rise of powerful nautical states like Portugal, armed with new ship designs and a relentless drive, sought a way around the knife. They sailed south down the coast of Africa and eventually found it, a sea route to India that bypassed Constantinople entirely. The city did not fall overnight, but its lifeblood began to drain away the moment its monopoly was broken. Why pay a premium to the Byzantine emperor when you could sail directly to the source? The strategic value of that legendary choke point plummeted. Its walls were still high, its armies still proud, but its economic reason for being had been quietly erased by a new line on a map. This is the recurring nightmare for any power built on a geographic monopoly. A new technology, a daring explorer, or a political realignment can suddenly make your greatest asset obsolete. The Khyber Pass, that legendary gateway between Central and South Asia, saw its importance wax and wane with the empires that fought over it. When a stable, unified power like the Moguls or the British controlled the regions on both sides, the pass thrived as a major artery. But when that political cohesion shattered, when the lands beyond became a patchwork of warring factions, the cost of securing the route often outweighed its benefits. The caravan masters would simply stop coming. The flow of wealth would cease not because the pass had moved, but because the political will to keep it open had evaporated. The land itself holds no power, only the perception of those who wish to cross it. This is the profound vulnerability of the chokehold. Its power is entirely borrowed from the consensus of the trading world. The moment a better, cheaper, or safer option appears, or the moment the guardian of the route can no longer guarantee safety, the flow of wealth simply finds a new path, leaving the former master of the world holding a key to an empty room. The silence of a Persian desert is not always empty. It can be the silence of a deep, artificial river flowing unseen beneath the sand, For thousands of years, the Khanate systems of Persia were the hidden heartbeats of civilization in an unforgiving landscape. These were not simple wells, but masterpieces of gravitational engineering, underground canals that sloped gently from the foothills of mountains, tapping into aquifers and carrying that precious water for dozens of miles to the arid plains below. The technology was brilliant. A series of vertical shafts were dug along the tunnel's path, not only for excavation but to provide air and serve as maintenance access for generations to come. At the surface, this lifeblood emerged to create a sudden, shocking burst of green, a thriving oasis where date palms swayed and fields of barley grew. These oases were not accidents of nature. They were manufactured landscapes, and they became the essential service stations for the great trade routes. A caravan crossing the desert was not just moving from one city to another, it was traveling from one khanate to the next, each one a guaranteed refuge of water, food, and shade. The trade route and the khanate system were a single, interdependent organism. One could not exist without the other. But a khanate is a living system, and it demands constant, skilled care. The tunnel, or the mother well, required regular cleaning to prevent silt from blocking the flow. The vertical shafts needed constant reinforcement against collapse. This was not work for amateurs. It required a guild of skilled laborers, the Mukanis, who passed their precise knowledge of hydrology and tunnel engineering from father to son. Theirs was a sacred trust, the guardians of a civilization's water. So what could break that chain of custody? The abandonment of these systems is a slow, quiet mystery. A major war could decimate the population, wiping out the specific families who knew how to maintain a particular khanate. A plague like the Black Death, which swept through the region in the 14th century, could achieve the same tragic result, leaving no one alive who remembered the subtle signs of an impending tunnel collapse. Sometimes the cause was economic. If the trade route itself shifted due to political changes or the rise of sea travel, the oasis would lose its economic purpose. Why would a community invest back-breaking labor into maintaining a complex water system if the caravans stopped coming and their surplus crops had no market? The maintenance would be deferred, then abandoned altogether. The consequences were absolute. As the khanate silted up and collapsed, the water flow would slow to a trickle and then stop. The fields would wither, the date palms would die, the oasis, that island of life, would be reclaimed by the desert sands, and with the oasis gone, the reason for the trade route to pass through that location vanished. The path itself would be rerouted or simply fade from use, another artery severed not by a sword, but by a final, fatal silence from below. The story of the khanate is a humbling lesson in infrastructure. It shows that the most visible signs of a trade network, the bustling caravanserais and the merchants haggling in the market, are merely the surface expression of a deeper, more fragile reality. They are utterly dependent on an unseen, diligently maintained foundation. When that foundation crumbles, the entire edifice of connection and commerce can vanish, leaving behind only a line of empty shafts in the desert, marking the grave of a river that once was. A corridor through the mountains once pulsed with the footsteps of empires. Stretching between the Black Sea and the Caspian, the passes of the Caucasus formed a natural bridge, a transcontinental crossroads where the nomadic cultures of the Eurasian steppe met the ancient kingdoms of the Middle East. During the zenith of the Kingdom of Urartu, with its formidable hilltop fortresses, or the golden age of medieval Georgia, this was a well-traveled highway. Caravans carried Caucasian timber and metals westward, returning with spices and silks, weaving together worlds that otherwise would have remained strangers. Yet the historical record of this corridor is not a continuous line, but a series of flickering lights, brightening, and then vanishing into near-total obscurity for centuries at a time. The true mystery is not its existence, but its repeated, almost complete erasure from the map of active commerce. When the political storms of history swept through, this vital artery did not just grow quiet, it was forgotten. The rise of the Mongol Ilkhanate turned the region into a battleground, its instability making the mountain pass as a realm of danger rather than opportunity. Later, the protracted conflicts between the Ottoman and Persian empires sealed the corridor's fate for generations. The caravans ceased their journeys. And with their cessation, something profound was lost: the intricate, practical knowledge of the route, the memory of which high pass was safest in the spring thaw, which valley offered a reliable stream, which local chieftain honored trade agreements. This hard-won intelligence evaporated within a generation or two. The corridor did not merely close, its very instructions were deleted. This forced a cycle of rediscovery that repeats throughout history. When peace finally returned, perhaps under a unifying Georgian queen or a powerful local Khan, merchants would have to start almost from scratch, piecing the route back together through trial and error, slowly rebuilding the trust and the knowledge that had been so easily lost. This cycle reveals a deep truth about the nature of connection. Some trade arteries are not built to last forever. They are living things that can enter a state of deep dormancy, their physical path still etched into the landscape, waiting for the right conditions of peace and prosperity to awaken them once more, to be reborn with the tides of history. A diver's lungs were the engine of this forgotten economy. For thousands of years, the pearl routes of the Persian Gulf pulsed with a rhythm set by human breath, with free divers plunging into the deep, their bodies the only tool to retrieve the ocean's most perfect gems. This was not a casual trade. It was a complex financial network involving boat owners, financiers who advanced money for expeditions, and merchants who moved the pearls along ancient desert trails and sea lanes to the courts of Rome, Byzantium, and Imperial China. Entire coastal cities from Bahrain to Oman were built upon this single, glistening industry, their culture and calendar dictated by the diving seasons. The wealth it generated was legendary, woven into the very identity of the region. And then, in the space of a few decades in the early 20th century, it was all over. The silence that fell was not from a war or a natural disaster, but from two quiet revolutions happening a world away. In Japan, a man named Kokichi Mikamoto perfected the technique for creating cultured pearls, a process that could reliably produce beautiful, nearly identical pearls at a fraction of the cost and human risk. Suddenly, a luxury that had been the exclusive prize of kings and emperors became accessible to a growing middle class. The market for natural pearls, the entire foundation of the Gulf's economy, evaporated almost overnight. At the very same moment, geologists struck a different kind of treasure beneath the same sands, a black gold that promised wealth on a scale the pearling house could never match. Why would a young man risk his life free diving when he could earn a steady wage in the nascent oil industry? The economic logic was brutal and absolute. The centuries-old knowledge of the pearl banks, the specific songs sung to coordinate divers, the intricate financial agreements, the entire cultural tapestry woven around the pearl became suddenly worthless. The boats were pulled ashore for the last time. The divers found new work. The trade routes that had carried these treasures to the world simply ceased to exist, not because the path was destroyed, but because the world no longer had a reason to walk it. This modern mystery holds a stark lesson. The most resilient trade artery can be rendered obsolete not by a conqueror's sword, but by a scientist's discovery and a shift in global economics. proving that the value of a connection is only as permanent as the world's demand for what it carries. The silence left by these lost roads is not random chaos. It whispers a logic of its own, a set of recurring patterns that explain how a world can be unmade. As we survey the graveyards of commerce from the Saharan salt trails to the monsoon sea lanes, we see that these arteries did not vanish for unique, unknowable reasons. They fell to a handful of familiar, relentless forces. The most common assassin was a more efficient competitor. Time and again, a maritime route rose to strangle its overland counterpart. A ship could carry the cargo of 1,000 camels, bypassing deserts, bandits, and endless tolls. The ancient incense trails of Arabia were not destroyed by war, but made irrelevant by Roman galleys sailing the Red Sea. The Trans-Saharan gold trade dwindled not because the gold ran out, but because Portuguese caravels offered a direct path from mine to mint. The logic of commerce is brutally simple, always seeking the path of least resistance and lowest cost. Another silent killer was the environment itself. A prolonged drought could desiccate the oases that served as stepping stones across a desert, turning a challenging journey into an impossible one. The lifeblood of the Garamantes was fossil water, a finite resource they eventually exhausted. For riverine empires, silt was a creeping death. A harbor like Muziris or a river port of the Srivijayan Empire could be slowly choked by sediment, until one day the deep-drafted ships of global trade could no longer dock. The very landscape that gave a route life could, over generations, turn against it. Then there is the geopolitical collapse, the shattering of the great empires that acted as patrons and police for these networks. The fall of Rome did not just mean the loss of a government. It meant the end of the legions that guarded the roads, the bankers who financed the caravans, and the wealthy customers who created the demand. The Pax Mongolica created a safe zone from the Pacific to the Mediterranean, and its disintegration instantly multiplied the risks and costs of travel 100-fold. Some routes died with the commodity they carried. The Bronze Age tin routes vanished not because the paths were lost, but because the invention of iron smelting made their entire purpose obsolete. The value of their specialized knowledge plummeted to zero, and we must confront the great illusion of the overnight disappearance. For most of these routes, the final silence was the last scene in a long, slow tragedy. The caravans did not stop all at once. First, they grew smaller. Then, they came less frequently. The maintenance on a khanat or a caravanserai was deferred, then abandoned altogether. The economic impact, however, could be shockingly sudden for the people whose lives were woven into the fabric of the route. A master shipwright, a camel breeder, a porter whose family had known a mountain pass for generations, they did not experience a slow decline. For them, the end came the season the merchants failed to return, the year the harbor finally silted up, the day the last order for bronze was cancelled. Their world of specialized skill and interlocking dependency shattered in a moment. Recognizing these patterns is more than an academic exercise. It holds up a dark mirror to our own world, a planet crisscrossed by digital highways, container ship routes, and global supply chains. We have built a system of breathtaking complexity and profound vulnerability, and the ghosts of forgotten trade arteries ask us a simple, haunting question. Which of these ancient patterns is quietly unfolding around us right now? A river can change its mind, and an entire sea can simply decide to leave. In the heart of Central Asia, the Amu Darya and Sadaria rivers once poured their life into a colossal inland ocean, the Aral Sea. Ancient geographers wrote of its vast, brackish waters, a blue jewel in a landscape of dust. On its fertile shores, the civilization of Khwarezm built cities that were legends of the Silk Road, their wealth drawn from the sea's abundance. This was not a silent, empty coast. It was a bustling maritime landscape where riverboats plied the waters between port towns, moving goods from the deep interior to the main caravan routes. These ports were not on the edge of a desert, but on the shore of a living sea. The true mystery of the Aral Sea is not just its tragic modern shrinking, but its ancient, slow-motion retreat over centuries, a geographical amnesia that silently rewrote the map of trade. As the sea gradually pulled back year by year, generation by generation, it left its ports stranded. A bustling waterfront would, over a lifetime, find itself separated from the water by miles of new, salty land. The docks that once welcomed trade ships now overlooked a cracked, barren plain. The river channels that fed the sea and served as liquid highways began to silt up, becoming unnavigable. The entire economic logic of the region, built on the presence of this great body of water, was systematically dismantled by the environment itself. Cities that were once hubs became isolated, then abandoned, as the trade simply could no longer reach them. The sea did not vanish overnight, but its retreat was a constant, draining pressure, a slow leak that eventually deflated a civilization. How do you maintain a fleet of fishing boats when the water is a day's journey from your city? How do you justify a bustling market when the ships stop coming? The people of Khwarezm did not wake up one day to find their world ended. They adapted for as long as they could, digging new canals, moving their settlements slowly toward the receding shoreline. But there is a limit to adaptation. Eventually, the cost of chasing the water became too great, and the economic heart of the region shifted to places where the geography was more stable. The story of the Aral Sea is a profound lesson in a different kind of collapse. It was not felled by an invasion or a shift in trade policy, but by the slow, inexorable change of the very ground and water that supported it. This is the power of a dynamic planet, a force that can erase the most prosperous trade landscapes not with a bang, but with a long, patient, and silent retreat. High on the Ethiopian plateau, the great stone obelisks of Axum stand as silent sentinels over a forgotten empire. This was not some isolated African kingdom, but a commercial titan whose coins, stamped with the image of its king, circulated from the heart of Rome to the markets of southern India. Its power flowed from the Red Sea, where its magnificent port of Adulis served as the definitive gateway. Every Roman ship laden with gold and wine, every Indian vessel carrying pepper and gems had to navigate the waters Axum controlled. The kingdom was the indispensable middleman in one of the ancient world's most lucrative circuits, its wealth and influence echoing across continents. So how does such a pivotal global player, a civilization that minted its own international currency, suddenly find itself pushed to the sidelines of history? The unraveling of Axum's trade network was a slow strangulation, a convergence of political, environmental, and geographical shifts that severed its vital connections. The first and most decisive blow was the rapid expansion of the Islamic Caliphate in the 7th century. Almost overnight, the political and religious landscape of the Red Sea basin was transformed. The new Islamic empire, with its power centered in Arabia, naturally took control of the sea lanes that Axum had once dominated. The old trading partners, the Byzantine Empire, was now a religious and political rival, and the flow of goods through these newly Islamic waters became a different kind of enterprise, one where the Christian kingdom of Axum was no longer the favored intermediary. Its strategic position became a strategic liability, but political change was only part of the story. The very land that sustained Axum may have turned against it. Geological evidence suggests a period of environmental stress, perhaps a prolonged drought or deforestation, that would have undermined the agricultural surplus needed to support its cities and finance its trade. A kingdom cannot project power across an ocean if it cannot feed its own people. The final physical cut came from the coast itself. The port of Adulis, the empire's economic lungs, began to choke. The same rivers that brought water from the highlands also carried down immense quantities of silt, gradually filling in the harbor. The deep-drafted ships of international commerce found it increasingly difficult to dock, and then, one day, impossible. What was once a bustling deep-water port became a silted-in lagoon, cutting the inland capital off from the lifeblood of maritime trade. Axum did not disappear. Its people and culture endured, evolving into the Ethiopia we know today. But its role as a global trade artery was permanently severed. It receded from a world power to a regional kingdom, its monumental obelisks becoming not symbols of current influence, but magnificent tombstones for a network that was silenced by a changing world. This quiet retreat from the global stage shows us that an empire can survive its own collapse as a commercial force, living on in a new, quieter form, its grand ambitions buried by silt and shifting politics. The river gorges of northern Burma held a secret more precious than any metal, a cold, green stone known as jadate. For 1,000 years, this stone traveled a road of its own, a parallel world to the Silk Road that demanded a different kind of courage. The journey began in the remote mines of the Hukong Valley, where raw boulders were wrested from the earth. These massive stones, sometimes weighing more than a man could lift, then faced a terrifying voyage. They were lashed to bamboo rafts, little more than floating platforms, and sent down violent, unnamed rivers. The raftsmen guiding them were masters of white water, reading the fury of the current to avoid rocks that could shatter their priceless cargo in an instant. If the rivers did not claim them, the mountains waited. Porters then carried the boulders over narrow, slippery paths carved into the sides of sheer cliffs, a single misstep meaning a fall into oblivion. This was the Jade Road, a network of extreme peril built entirely for a single, exquisite commodity. So why would anyone endure such a journey? In China, this particular type of jade was not just a gem, it was a cultural obsession, a substance believed to contain the essence of heaven and earth. An emperor's seal carved from Burmese jadate was a symbol of divine mandate, its value so immense it made the staggering risks worthwhile. The entire route was a delicate, living entity, sustained not by empires, but by a fragile understanding between the Burmese kingdoms who controlled the mines and the Chinese dynasties who craved the stone. This was its greatest vulnerability, when relations between these powers soured, when a Burmese king decided to leverage his control or a Chinese emperor made a territorial demand, the first casualty was always the road. The border would be sealed, the permits granted to specific merchant families were suddenly revoked, the rafts remained on the riverbanks, and the porters sat idle in their villages. During these long periods of political friction, the route did not just grow quiet, it began to be forgotten. The specific knowledge required to navigate it was not written down, it was stored in the muscles and memories of the raftsmen and guides. They knew which tributary was passable only in the dry season, which mountain pass was safest after a landslide, which local chieftain expected a tribute of salt for safe passage. When one generation failed to teach the next because the work had vanished, that intricate map of practical intelligence was erased. The final, quiet end came not from a great war, but from a simple search for a better way. As maritime trade grew more reliable, it became possible to ship jade around the coast, a slower but far safer journey. Later, other overland routes were developed during times of peace, paths that were longer but avoided the deadliest gorges. The original, brutal shortcut lost its reason for being. The world had found a way to get its jade without gambling with so many lives. The silence that fell over those particular river gorges is a profound lesson. It shows that a trade artery can be severed not by a natural disaster or a technological shift, but by the simple, persistent weight of political disagreement. The path itself still exists, hidden by jungle, but the human consensus that gave it life, the unspoken agreement that made the risk worthwhile, dissolved into history, leaving behind only the whisper of a river that once carried empires on its back. Their stone great houses are haunting riddles in the desert sun. In the high, dry mesas of the American Southwest, the ancestral Pueblones, often called the Anasazi, performed a miracle of water and will. They were master hydrologists in a land of little rain, carving intricate canals and building vast reservoirs to capture every precious drop from the infrequent storms. This engineered landscape allowed them to grow enough maize, beans, and squash to support large, concentrated populations in spectacular sites like Choco Canyon. With full granaries came influence, and their trade networks began to pulse with life. Turquoise mined from distant sources was shaped into beads and pendants, traveling hundreds of miles. Distinctive black-on-white pottery, prized for its beauty, moved along well-worn trails, connecting scattered communities across an immense and unforgiving landscape. The entire system, from the grandest great house to the smallest trade bead, was built upon the fragile foundation of captured water. So what could cause such an intricate society to unravel? The evidence points to a slow, grinding collision with the environment's absolute limits. A prolonged drought, one spanning decades, began to tighten its grip. The summer rains failed year after year. The reservoirs, once brimming with life, shrank to muddy puddles. The meticulously maintained canals ran dry. But the drought alone might not have been the sole culprit. Generations of intensive farming, coupled with the need for timber to build their massive structures, likely led to deforestation and soil exhaustion. The land, pushed beyond its capacity for too long, could no longer support the grand experiment. The agricultural surplus that fueled the trade and fed the concentrated populations vanished. How do you trade turquoise for pottery when everyone is hungry? The networks of exchange, which required a steady flow of goods and food to sustain the travelers, simply disintegrated. The people did not vanish, but they made a rational, if heartbreaking, choice. They dispersed, migrating to areas with more reliable water sources, leaving their magnificent stone cities to the wind and the dust. The silence that fell over Choco Canyon was not sudden, but it was absolute. It is the sound of a society reaching its ecological breaking point, a stark reminder that even the most brilliant human systems are ultimately bound by the generosity of the land they depend upon. The silent caravanserais of the Silk Road and the ghost ports of the Indian Ocean are more than just ruins. They are a humbling lesson in the fragility of connection itself. We often picture empires as monuments of stone and legions of steel, but their true foundation was always something far more delicate: the invisible, thrumming networks of exchange that pumped goods, ideas, and wealth across continents. An empire is a superstructure, a magnificent palace built upon a web of pathways, and when those pathways fail, the palace can crumble with startling speed. The collapse is rarely from a single blow. It is a cascade, a domino effect that begins when one critical support gives way. A prolonged drought desiccates the oases that feed the caravans. A new sea route makes an overland journey obsolete. A political schism shatters the peace that guaranteed safe passage. The demand for a vital commodity, like tin or incense, evaporates overnight. In our own time, we have seen glimpses of this ancient vulnerability. A pandemic can freeze global supply chains. A political dispute can halt the flow of energy. A storm can close a vital shipping lane, causing ripples of shortage and delay across the world. The stories of these vanished roads are not mere historical curiosities. They are urgent cautionary tales, reminding us that our own interconnected civilization is built upon a similar, fragile web. The digital highways, the container ship routes, the intricate dance of just-in-time manufacturing, these are the trade arteries of our age. They are robust, but they are not invincible. Let the silence of these forgotten paths be a call to value, to understand, and to protect the connections that sustain our world. For the ghost of every abandoned route asks us one final, haunting question. Which of our own vital arteries, humming with invisible traffic today, will the historians of the future puzzle over when they too have fallen silent? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you were captivated by these untold stories, subscribe for more journeys into the mysteries of our